She runs a history program. Public history component includes museum studies, and it's all run online. Susie, one of her professors was Peter Van Mensch, and she's also worked with Gary Edson. Susie is a former board member, 2007-2010, of ICAFON. Okay, Susie, it's all yours.
Buenos dias. So I'm ecstatic to be here in Cuba, and I will be presenting actually a completed paper. Nonetheless, I welcome any constructive critique after the presentation. I'm a little bit nervous about my writing now after Elizabeth's presentation on writing. If I have my thesis correct. 4 decades ago, the concept of science as signifier and signified had been introduced to us by Jean Baudrillard in cultural theory as he applied the meaning of objects to interior space, antiquities, restoration of antiquities, advertising, and branding. Based on these concepts, this museological discussion reflects on the poetics, politics, and geopolitics of free-range interpretation and non-profit versus income generator of the function of museums. Several museologists have already discussed the capitalist concept of the system of objects within the museum space, such as Clifford, while Dewdney, DeBosa, and Walsh briefly mentioned Baudrillard's idea of postmodernity and communication of the art museum. Fitchett and Sarin, who are marketing scholars, explore value theory by Baudrillard, mainly with a Marxist ideology employing a slightly different approach. For Baudrillard, there is no longer any difference between the commodity, alienated from symbolic exchange, and the sign, alienated from a referent. Consequently, notions of semiotic commodities, or commodity signs, emerge to characterize contemporary consumption, whereby the sign itself, rather that which it was once signified, becomes the focus of consumer desire and value. Scrutinizing these Baudrillardian concepts, Fitchett and Sarin applied sign value in museum consumption as traditional exchanges in marketing. However, they discussed theories by Heidegger, calling it design value. In Hegelianism, existence or determinate being. In existentialism, human existence. They explain there is no consumption of the museum experience. Rather, it is the existence or presence of the museum building and collections, as well as the immersive exhibits. Although they lead us to the value concept from Marx, Baudrillard, to Heidegger, there is a disconnection between the three concepts. Design value is about being here and being there and in the museum, a socially constructed shared value. The consumption value of the object as well as the discourse of the sign use value is semiotic, and signifiers do not have to be touched, owned, and exchanged. In recent studies on the theory and analysis of artistic creation in the museum, also mentioned in the introduction to the symposium call for papers on Altschuler, Carr, and Levine, The Return of Curiosity, What Museums Are Good For in the 21st Century by Nicholas Thomas discusses the significance of museums and how they developed into that which is actually the story of a group or community, marginalized or not, and its sustenance of civil society. There is also the concept of the museum as method, where he actually discusses an idea similar to that of Peter Van Mensch, who demonstrated the documentation being layered and having relationships with other artifacts. The other concept that Thomas examines is a collection as creative technology with newer forms and juxtapositions of collections with multimedia in connection to older collections, and newer renditions of works of art. This theory is best explained by Van Mensch, distinguishing the stages of the biography of artifacts into the conceptual, factual, and then the actual stage. Thomas's discussions correlate to the function of interpretation according to museum visitor studies, whether it still remains within the social capital, and in more recent studies by Icafon entitled Visiting the Visitor, an inquiry into the visitor business and museums, exploring dialogues, empowerment, and meaning-making by visitors. Most of already published literature brings a practical implication to the management of museums through marketing and branding. Thus, as we now witness in museum studies literature, a number of publications address marketing and public relations as early as 1983. In reference to Baudrillard's The Object of Science, this paper itself is an interpretation of the current exhibitions to analyze the museum through semantic, cultural, and political lenses and identifying the poetics and geopolitics of communication. Applying Baudrillard's description of collecting, museums are actually returning to the poetics and politics of storage-like display and pedagogical rationale as when museums were first founded. The quest for authenticity being founded on itself is thus very precisely a quest for an alibi. Being elsewhere is what Baudrillard notes in the neo-cultural syndrome, restoration. Especially as we can see this trend in the Victorians, who decided how restoration should be